Okay, we're talking about flight today. Uh, a lot of people think that flying would be one of the best superpowers to actually have. Um, and it is pretty cool. I mean, after all, you wouldn't have to pay for any major car expenses. If you were worried, like try to like go for a hike, and you got lost track of time, you would just simply go over it instead of going around it. Where I live, there is this mountain community, but you have to go to one town and then double back just to get to it. So a lot of people I've actually talked to said they don't even know it existed. But there are definitely a lot of elements to flight that most people may not said actually think about. And the first one is, what exactly are you using to fly? I mean, are It's like because a lot of said other superpowers can allow you to fly through some other methods, but not every hero or villain has such methods. So, are you talking about wearing an Iron Man suit, a jetpack, or the rocket boots that Syndrome developed? That would some, definitely be a bit of an issue if you had a very limited fuel source. I mean, Iron Man, when he had to use the inferior arc reactor, it sounded like if he had to actually use it for some extended period of time, he would have to essentially um, said go someplace, wait for it to recharge. I'm not entirely sure how long that would be, uh, and said to get back on top. Jetpacks and the boots may have a chance of actually exploding on you. Um, Mostly because you said you're probably if you're talking about modern day jetpacks, they have a lot of canisters to make sure you can get to places and travel, a decent speed. But if you're talking about being a hero, you got to travel pretty fast. So other things that might come to mind in terms of using other methods of flight in terms of accessories would be a set of wings. Maybe you have like what Birdman has, like it's built into the suit. Instead, if you're a magic, you have magic carpets, wing sandals, um, maybe even broomsticks. But there are definitely some issues with those, especially with the broomsticks, because um, you don't know. I said you always have to try to create something better every time. Just look at the Harry Potter series. They mentioned that by the time I said when Harry was starting, a Clean Sweep 7 was available, yet a lot of databases don't make it that fast. And by the time Ron got his clean sweep, a lot of databases just say it's about a little more than 70 miles an hour. And I'm thinking that doesn't make any sense because when Madam Hooch said she learned to fly on a Silver Arrow that was the Firebolts of their time, you honestly would think that, it set the precedent very high, for speed. So that's why something like the Nimbus line would be there. And then you would have some foreign, said other countries that would have it. They actually, said the American Quidditch team had something called a Star Sweeper that by the time it reached like the middle of the said like the said the mid 2000s, it had already surpassed the Firebolt, but they never really said what made it so fast. And then they had a Japanese broom that was pretty good. And then there was some weird African broom that, while fast, wasn't very durable. And when they got the Firebolt Supreme, they didn't really say how much faster it was supposed to be. Because if you really have to go really far away, um, in a short period of time, you want to make sure that you are traveling, you know, pretty fast with it, and that's actually causes a lot of problems if you are flying. But so, so I can't really think of too many other. So in terms of actually flying, you actually also have to determine whether or not you are levitating or actually flying, because someone like Magneto just uses it's a magnetism to actually instead of float around, but they never really showed him like flying. He said flying. Um, it seems like as long as he's near something to kind of, orbit around, he's fine. But in X Men 2, when he broke out of his plastic cell, it said on the ground, it actually said 100-foot drop. And while he did have those little orbs, it made it seem as though that was a sizable amount of distance to fall before he would actually be able to protect himself. So I said that's why a lot of versions of him often will just put extra bits of metal in his suit, so he's just causing himself to actually lift it. But I'm not entirely sure if he had any major thrusting. So in this case, other forms of levitation might be like Raven from Teen Titans or Doctor Strange. But unless you actually see someone going, not just to the top of a very tall building, you would have to see them go well above that, and then someone else would say, "Okay, we want you to go to this place. It's about 30 miles away, um, and we'll time you." So even if you travel, a mile a minute, it's about 60 miles an hour. It's going to take you half an hour to get there, and sometimes, it just seems like a lot of heroes always want to be, close to the action. Same thing with villains, so the fact that they could use another calamity to cover their own, or if they were the cause, they use it to escape. So I always do find that what telekinetic flight to be a little strange because they always say, "Oh, we're lifting, using the power of our minds," and yet, they actually seem like they're like flailing their arms around instead to try to stabilize themselves. So it's definitely might be a bit better than what Magneto could do, but I really don't call that super flight. But but in this case, I always would think that there needs to be some type of hover or floating power that allows any character to lift off the ground for a little bit. It may even slow them down if they fall, and then they use whatever thrust power they have. Because like Thor and Storm, they actually more or less create little tornadoes around them to actually lift them. Other characters, like the Human Torch, he basically sets himself on fire and that's enough. But it seems like he's totally dependent upon being, covered in fire to actually um, remain remain in the air. So he said if you're talking about like Hawkgirl or Hawkman, depending upon which one you like more, they have their wings that would allow them to definitely reach some pretty good heights and speeds. Um, but you never know. But you still kind of want to know what their maximum is. And regardless of whatever people would say, I do not think Peregrine Falcons are the second fastest animal in the world, because their best attribute is to fall to the ground and then correct themselves. They're not reaching that point. So if you were to say that there's some type of buoyancy that has to go to maintain a certain altitude, for heroes, they have to provide that thrust just to get up there, and then they can relax. So if you remember the climax of Iron Man 1, he tried to go to maximum altitude just to get Obadiah to ice up, and then all of a sudden he just said, Jarvis said, 2% power. So, but he seemed like he was up there for like a few seconds, not really doing much of anything. It was just the fact that wasn't any fuel left in the tank. So that could always definitely be a thing. Um, and you never know which kind of heroes one could possibly have. I mean, if you're, different universes would have something different. Um, so someone like Static Shock, he rides on his little disc, and I think in the future he kind of evolved to actually get a little bit stronger, but it seemed like he still had to use his disc to make sure to get somewhere. And he was actually able to go quite a bit higher because he found I forget one of Batman's jets. I guess we call it the Bat Jet. But someone like Electro from the Marvel Universe seems like he flies around with an electric, tail, like a ghost. So very different tricks as a whole. And sometimes it could be a little too obvious that a character is flying and they can suffer from their for not having stealth. Very the lantern cores are the perfect example. It seems like every time, one just has to float to get something, just for anything, you see the veil. I mean, Doctor Light was also the same way. So that could also definitely be a bit of an issue if you're trying to remain stealthy. I definitely would say is that camera said even other things, like gaseous emissions, you can become lighter than air, but the question is this stuff, going to affect anyone, below you, or it said, and what happens if you get caught up in a pretty serious gust of wind if you're using that method to fly? Gravity manipulation could, in theory, work because a lot of DC characters have something called gravitrons in their atomic structure, and it's almost like when say I'm going to fly, they nullify um, the gravitational pull to makes everything work, which isn't too bad. But you never know what kind of universe you're going to have. Be almost kind of like the weird polarization that Ernest had in Ernest Goes to Jail, like when he was struck by lightning, so was electrocuted. He essentially ended up being polarized and was able to kind of move around. So that could definitely be impressive, but highly circumstantial. So and so you just don't know really what you want to do, and if you actually are someone that has to use like fire, lightning, or wind, maybe light as well, to help you fly, you are using up a lot of energy as well. Um, Even if you are a very competent hero, there's only so much that can be done with every say on the energy thing because I always thought everything would work like how it was in Marvel Ultimate the first Marvel Ultimate Alliance games where they said that flying doesn't cost anything, but you won't recharge, and energy attacks require double the energy. So you periodically have to land, break open items to recover the energy. So, yeah, if you're using up way too much power, just to make sure you can fly, you might have to find something else. But there definitely said one, but here's the second biggest issue in terms of flying is that the higher you go, the worse the conditions are going to be. You got crosswinds, the air gets thin, it said, and a lot colder. So you can't just, fly around there like it's nothing. I mean, I'm pretty sure that, that there's a reason why airplanes only go so high. Um, and while in this case, it would say, yes, the pressure will actually just normalize if there is a hole in the plane. But the idea is the fact that, like kind of just like with what happened with Iron Man, plus 40 altitude, he started to ice up really bad. And when you when you break it down, that's rough. It said roughly only about 8 miles up, and you know they always would say that space kind of has a range of starting maybe about 80 miles up, and then there's another part of the atmosphere that most people don't know about that's a little bit higher, and then that's kind of where the space stations orbit. So the fact of the matter is, like when you go up to Mount Everest, they literally have the dead zone because there's just not any oxygen to really use. So you'll have to be lugging around a bunch of equipment to make sure you're kept perfectly warm, and you can breathe pretty well. And depending upon how high you can fly, some of those winds could be pretty intense. It can definitely also be pretty intense. So you don't want to be able to only fly about 60 miles an hour and hear winds about 70 miles an hour going up, and you're pushed around like a leaf. So you said even if you have some type of stabilizers like wings or airfoils that allow you to kind of glide like a flying squirrel, the fact of the matter is that I said if you cannot overcome, certain amounts of atmospheric disturbances, um, yeah, I said atmospheric disturbances, you're not going to really do too well as flying. But then again, there really isn't as much of a call to actually go that high as well. Um, it said if you're unless someone is actually attacking some of the top, like Mount Kilimanjaro, Everest, K2, you're not really going to need to actually fly, so much higher than an actual, instead, than maybe a little bit above what the Burj Khalifa is. And the way I've always been able to kind of describe this is that you're essentially a balloon tied to a string. And as long as the string, it says as long as you can go within a certain range, you'll be fine. But as soon as you try to go just the maximum point, you realize you can't do it. Almost as though like whatever powers you actually have says, yeah, it said you won't be able to kind of correct this thing. Instead of just going really, really high up, and then you realize, okay, I'm not actually a hero with a time limit, and you realize, okay, I just got the alarm saying this is last call. I have to get down as soon as possible, and you're nowhere near, something very tall that might actually ease everything. Because, like with a balloon, if it's on the floor, it's not going to be very high. But if you put it like on a kitchen counter, it will actually rise up a little bit more. But I always would say you kind of would need a certain amount of, balance, above it. So a very narrow, um, yeah, something like it's like paper thin, like a gondola um, cable, probably would not be enough to actually have it. But if you were to be, I said, or even like certain mountains, but if you were somehow able to go over a series of mountains, that might actually provide just enough. But the idea is the fact that you could be going up, down, at all kinds of random points. I don't know why that's dimming, but the idea is just the fact that eventually you will get a little bit better, and the string will naturally get a little bit longer. But if you're a rookie, you might as well be Neville Longbottom at his first flying lesson. He was kind of bouncing around. They never really said if it was somehow jinxed by Quirrell or just he said, or just the fact that he just kind of rose up and then fell. It's like you honestly would think that after so many years, they would find everything you would need to actually be fully stabilized in that point. I mean, that's something where, being a part of the Lanterns would definitely be very helpful. But the problem is that you've got to make sure you keep an eye on the power source. Um, so you could pull over and say your oath and get your recharged. But yeah. But then again, there are different types of conditions in which flight might actually be different. If you were somehow out of a planet's gravitational pull, like in, right at the International Space Station, you said you're in that state of free fall, you know, and said you're just going with it. You can move around as much as you want, provided you have the protection of a spacesuit, and that's not going to be a big deal. But as soon as you are pulled back into the gravitational pull, it said you're going to be falling probably way too fast to be caught up. And even if there wasn't anything involving the friction, it said causing you to burn up, you're just going way too fast. Kind of like if you were to run down a very, very, very steep hill, if you actually stop running, you said for anything, you're going to lose your balance, and who knows what kind of damage you're going to get, especially if it's more of a road rather than, grass. It said an impact from sand might be okay, but you would have to just have something that would help you to stop, and you never know. But a lot of other characters that can fly pretty well actually are pretty good submariners just in terms of being able to move around. Now, I'm not entirely sure if there is an exact difference between one that's able to actually fly and then one actually going through water, because you would have to kind of push the water both out away in front of you and then kind of have it circle back and push you into that. So, like almost as though you're displacing the water, is said to move a little bit quicker. I mean, if anyone's ever seen a line cross through an etch a sketch, said on an etch a sketch, you actually see, like even if you were to make like the tightest lines possible, you actually would start to see, the lines actually slowly split apart. So if in theory that's all it does, yeah, it said it's pretty impressive. But the idea is just the fact that you already kind of have your buoyancy, you can move around, and less likely to actually crash into anything that you can't, say that you wouldn't be able to see anyways. And yeah, so but also you got to make sure that if you're going to be, flying for anything, you got to make. I said I definitely would say, oh, sorry. You got to make sure that you know what your actual top speed is comparison to something else, because I said I always believe that if you have the ability to both fly and run very fast, you will always fly faster than what you can run. So that's where essentially Superman would not be able to go after the Flash. Once he, in a foot race, flying might definitely be up there, but the Flash could pretty much stop time and everything else is there. I would just, in this case, if you have the ability to temporarily, um, I said accelerate yourself, for something extra, like when you find your gym class, you have to run, run across, said run the track, and you're on your last lap, and you decide just to gun it, same thing with flight, you know, you definitely do have that, but you may only be able to do it in very short bursts, kind of like what happened in Galaxy Quest when they tried going turbo, and it seems like it just wasn't actually built for that. But the question is, did they ever have some kind of light speed or something? Almost as though you can accelerate pretty quickly, but you may only be able to do it for so long. Almost as though energy goes into a specific power chamber, and once it's there, it's like, okay, we're not accepting anything. The chamber is way too hot, and the fuel would essentially just burn up anyways. So you don't. So even if you could do pretty well through the usage of energy manipulation, the fact of the matter is, if you go, always give everything at your absolute maximum for no reason, you're going to just wear yourself out. You don't want to be someone says, yes, I could travel up to 300 miles an hour, and I'm going to go solve this issue that's only like half a mile away. And it's like, and then you get there and it's nothing too serious, but just like you're just basically listening to what the police say or something else. It's just like you got there fast, but what was the point? And then, if you actually are dealing with the whole breathing issues, you would have to make sure you breathe pretty well, because fighter pilots have to learn how to actually breathe when they do various maneuvers, because as they're moving, they're fighting various G forces, and people, civilians will always kind of pass out, even vomit once they're done, because they're just not used to having that. You kind of have to build it up. So if you were to suddenly, make a very sharp turn, you might pass out, and then even if you suddenly stop, the rest of the body needs to make sure it has some way of canceling the inertia, because that sudden stop might as well be the equivalent of going down a very busy highway at insanely top speed, and then immediately coming to a halt, like through something. And the idea is just the fact that you're not going to feel any good, and everything can kind of crash you. I mean, if you're talking about the idea of a sudden stop, copper, um, with its ionized properties, will actually prevent a magnet from actually from actually fully reaching it. So, and just that sudden stop might be too much for someone. And But then, and naturally, you would have to worry about any type of airborne vehicles. I mean, if you don't have any way to, if you just fly, like that's your biggest power, you're not gonna. It said you're not gonna be able to avoid too many things if you're way too high up. There's nothing up there, and there's way too many smart ballistics, going for you. So that would definitely be a pretty serious issue as well. Said just kind of like what happened with Icarus. You went too high, wings it said wings melted, and he paid the price. I mean, you just want to make sure that you know there are definitely no fly zones for a lot of places. And I could definitely would say is that instead of a simple place, simple places to actually fly even just a little bit off the ground would probably be mountain trails that seem to go on for like say go on for miles. You have no clue where they would go. The idea is the fact that if you can, you know, no one's going to bother you. Instead, go for it. So yeah, yeah, because the problem is that flying is definitely a very like seems to be like the ultimate kind of trick. Some characters may have something else like advanced teleportation that would save them the trouble, but you know, it always just seems as though that, if you can't fly, certain, resources will be available. And if you don't want to use the resources and there's a disaster said and no one wants to pick you up, you're in trouble. So, yeah, and those are my thoughts said on flight. The next topic I will be talking about is super strength and why it definitely has a lot more. It also has a lot more levels than most people would think. And I've actually used it, thoughts about it to actually fall asleep to, say for a lot of nights. So it will definitely make you think as well. All right, have a good one.